My mother-in-law, Lydia, announced she was leaving both family estates entirely to my sister-in-law, claiming my husband and I did fit the image. She smiled, thinking she controlled the legacy. She forgot that her own father, the actual owner, was sitting right there, and he had a pen. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The migraine had started around noon, a dull throb behind my left eye that usually signaled a storm front coming in, or in this case, a visit from my mother-in-law, Lydia. I was sitting at the long mahogany table in the dining room of the Victorian estate, a house my husband, Mark, and I had spent the last 6 years restoring with our own money and bare hands. My hands were actually trembling slightly as I reached for my water glass. I was exhausted. I had spent the morning coordinating with the contractors about the foundation repair for the guest cottage, and the afternoon rushing to prepare the celebratory dinner Lydia had demanded. She hadn't told us what we were celebrating. She just said attendance was mandatory. Mark sat next to me, his shoulders hunched. He looked like a man bracing for a physical blow. He worked 60-hour weeks as a structural engineer, yet every spare moment he had was poured into this property, ensuring his grandfather, Robert, could live out his final years in the home he built. Mark was a good man, too good for the woman sitting at the head of the table. Lydia tapped her spoon against her champagne flute. The sharp ding, ding, ding cut through the tense silence of the room. "Attention, everyone," Lydia said, her voice smooth and practiced, like a hostess on a morning talk show. She smoothed the front of her designer silk blouse. "I have an announcement, a decision I've made regarding the future of this family." She paused for effect, her eyes sliding over Mark and me with a look that could only be described as dismissive pity. Then, her gaze landed on Vanessa, Mark's younger sister. Vanessa was 30, unemployed, and currently scrolling through Instagram under the table. "Vanessa, darling, put the phone away," Lydia cooed. "This concerns you." Vanessa looked up, flipping her hair. "What is it, Mom? I have plans in an hour." "Well, cancel them," Lydia beamed. "As you all know, with Dad's health declining," she gestured vaguely toward the end of the table where Robert, her father, sat in his wheelchair, "I have been thinking about the succession of the estates. The main house here and the lake cottage." My stomach tightened. Robert was right there. He was eating his soup, his hand shaking slightly, but he was lucid. He was present. Talking about his death like a business transaction while he was eating dinner was grotesque, but that was Lydia. "I've decided to finalize the will early to avoid any confusion later," Lydia continued, taking a sip of wine. "I am leaving both the Victorian estate and the lake house to Vanessa." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Mark dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "What?" "It makes the most sense," Lydia said, speaking over him as if he hadn't spoken. "Vanessa is the heart of this family. She has the spirit, the verve. She represents the image I want for our legacy. You know, someone who can host, who can bring life to these old walls." "Mom," Mark said, his voice cracking. "Martha and I have lived here for 6 years. We pay the taxes. We paid for the roof. We take care of Grandpa." Lydia waved her hand dismissively, a flick of her wrist that erased 6 years of our sweat and tears. "And we appreciate your caretaking, Mark, we really do. But let's be honest. You and Martha are functional, you're worker bees, you don't have the flair for ownership. Vanessa needs the security. You two can always rent an apartment nearby. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." I looked at Vanessa. She was beaming, a predatory grin spreading across her face. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't look at her grandfather. She just looked at the room like she was mentally rearranging the furniture. "Does Grandpa have a say in this?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage boiling in my blood. Lydia laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Oh, Martha, Dad signed power of attorney over to me years ago. He trusts my judgment implicitly. Don't you, Daddy?" She didn't wait for Robert to answer. She just turned back to Vanessa and raised her glass. To the new mistress of the manor. I looked at Mark. His face had gone pale, stripped of color. He looked like a child who had just been told he wasn't wanted. I reached under the table and squeezed his hand hard. The betrayal wasn't just about the money or the house. It was the confirmati. On of what we had always feared. To Lydia, we were nothing but staff. But as I looked down the table, I saw something Lydia missed. Robert had stopped eating. He was looking at his daughter with a clarity and a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. The betrayal cut deeper than the years of labor. It was a total erasure of our existence. The drive back to our wing of the house, technically we lived in the converted carriage house attached to the main estate, was silent, but it was a loud silence. It was filled with the things Mark wasn't saying because he was too broken to say them. When we got inside, Mark didn't take off his coat. He just sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the floorboards we had refinished together last Christmas. "I can't believe it," he whispered. "She's giving it all to Vanessa. Vanessa can't even keep a cactus alive, Martha. She's going to sell it. You know she is. She'll sell the lake house for quick cash and she'll let this place rot until she flips it." I sat beside him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders. "She thinks she can, Mark, but thinking and doing are different things." "She has power of attorney," Mark said, his voice hollow. "She made sure to mention that. She's been planning this. That's why she had us fix the foundation last month. She waited until the heavy lifting was done to kick us out." That was the knife twist. The timing. We had just drained our savings to fix the structural issues in the basement because Lydia claimed she was cash poor at the moment. We did it to keep a roof over Robert's head. Now, that investment was a gift to Vanessa. The next morning, the reality of our situation arrived in the form of a sports car, revving in the driveway. I was in the kitchen making tea for Robert. I took care of his morning routine, breakfast, medication, and reading the newspaper headlines to him, because Lydia usually didn't wake up until noon. The back door flew open, and Vanessa breezed in, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a tape measure. She didn't knock. Why would she? It was her house now. "Morning, Martha," she chirped, not looking at me. She walked straight to the window treatments. "God, these drapes are hideous. Are these original? They smell like old people." I gripped the handle of the kettle. "Good morning, Vanessa. Robert is sleeping in the next room. Keep your voice down." "Grandpa can sleep through a hurricane," she scoffed. She snapped the tape measure out, letting it retract with a loud thwack. "I'm thinking of blowing out this wall. Open concept, you know? Lydia said I could start renovations as soon as the papers are signed next month." "You're going to knock down a load-bearing wall in an 1800s Victorian?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Vanessa turned to me, pulling her sunglasses down her nose. "I'll hire people for the details, Martha. You worry too much. That's why Mom says you're aging so fast. You need to relax." She walked over to the counter, picked up an apple from the bowl, took a bite, and put it back. "By the way," she said, chewing loudly, "Mom wants you to start packing up the carriage house. I promised my yoga instructor she could move in there by August. It'll be a great income stream for me." My blood ran cold. August was 3 weeks away. "We have a lease, Vanessa," I lied. "We didn't. We had a verbal agreement with Robert from years ago." "Mom says since she's the executor and POA, previous agreements are void during the transfer," Vanessa smiled. It was a cruel, empty smile. "Nothing personal, it's just business. You guys understand, right?" She didn't wait for an answer. She wandered out of the room, tapping on the walls, humming to herself. I finished making the tea, my hands shaking with rage. I walked into the sunroom where Robert spent his mornings. He was sitting in his chair, looking out at the garden I had planted. "Here's your tea, Robert," I said softly, placing the cup on the small table beside him. He turned his head slowly. He was 89, frail, and often underestimated. People saw the wheelchair and the tremor and assumed the mind was gone too, but I knew better. I spent hours with him every day. I knew he listened. "She's measuring the walls," Robert rasped. His voice was like dry leaves scraping together. "Yes," I said, sitting on the ottoman beside him. "She is." "Lydia," he said, staring at the steam rising from the tea. "She always did like shiny things, never cared much for how they were built, just how they looked." "She wants to give it all to her, Robert," I said, my voice trembling. "Mark and we might have to leave." Robert turned his eyes to me. They were a piercing, watery blue. He reached out and placed his cold hand over mine. "Leaving is a choice, Martha," he whispered. "Ownership is a document." He tapped his finger against the side of his teacup. Tap, tap, tap. "She thinks she holds the pen," he muttered, almost to hymns. "Elf, but she forgot to check the ink." It was a strange thing to say, but with Robert, nothing was ever accidental. To understand the cruelty of what was happening, you have to understand the history. Mark and I weren't just living here, we were the life support system for the estate. I am a historical archivist by trade. Preserving things, documents, artifacts, homes, is literally what I do. When Mark and I moved in 6 years ago, the estate was crumbling. Lydia had been managing it, which meant she spent the maintenance budget on vacations to Cabo and networking galas. We stepped in because Mark couldn't bear to see his grandfather's legacy rot. We poured our salaries into the plumbing, the electrical work, the slate roof. We did it with the unspoken understanding, reinforced by Robert's gratitude, that this would be our home. But then there was Lydia. Lydia wasn't just a bad mother. She was a professional social climber who had never actually climbed anything. She described herself as a lifestyle consultant, though I never saw her consult anyone on anything other than how to spend money they didn't have. She was obsessed with appearances. To her, Mark, a structural engineer with dirt under his fingernails, was an embarrassment. He was too practical, too quiet. Vanessa, on the other hand, was Lydia's mirror. Loud, flashy, and utterly devoid of substance. Vanessa had launched 5 different businesses in the last decade, funded by Lydia, and by extension, Robert's dwindling accounts. A jewelry line, a life coaching brand, a dog walking app, all failed. But to Lydia, Vanessa was a visionary. That afternoon, after Vanessa's invasion, I went to check the mail. I found a heavy envelope addressed to Lydia. It was from a high-end law firm in the city. The return address was embossed in silver. Lydia was on the porch, sipping an iced tea, watching the gardener, who she only hired when she knew guests were coming, trim the hedges. "Is that for me?" she asked, extending a manicured hand without getting up. I handed her the envelope. "Looks legal." She ripped it open, her eyes scanning the document greedily. A smirk curled her lips. "Excellent," she murmured. "The draft is ready." "The draft for the will?" I asked, standing my ground. Lydia looked up over her sunglasses. "Yes, Martha, the transfer deeds. I'm having the notary come on Friday during the family barbecue. I want everyone to witness the transition. It's important for the community to see the torch being passed." "Friday?" I asked. "That's 3 days away." "Efficient, isn't it?" She folded the paper and tapped it against her chin. "Oh, and Martha, make sure the house is spotless. I've invited a few friends from the club. I want them to see how lucky Vanessa is." She wasn't just kicking us out. She was turning our eviction into a spectator sport. She wanted an audience for her benevolence toward her favorite child, and she wanted Mark and me there as props to applaud our own demise. "One more thing," Lydia added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't bother Robert with this. He gets so confused lately. I don't want him agitated before the signing. I'll handle him." "Handle him," I repeated. "He's your father, Lydia, not a piece of luggage." "He's a tired old man who needs me to make the hard decisions," she snapped, her mask slipping for a second. "Now, go help the caterers. They'll be here in an hour to scout the location." I walked away, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was rushing this. She was rushing it because she knew, deep down, that what she was doing was morally bankrupt. She wanted the ink dry before anyone could object. But as I passed the library, I saw Robert. He wasn't asleep. He was sitting at his desk, the heavy oak one he hadn't used in years. He had the old rotary phone receiver held to his ear, the secure landline that bypassed the digital system Lydia monitored. He was speaking in a low, firm voice, a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. "Yes," Robert said. "Friday, noon, come to the back entrance. Bring the notary. No, she doesn't know, that's the point." I froze in the hallway. Robert looked up and saw me standing there. He didn't hang up, he didn't look confused, he winked. The library smelled of cedar, old paper, and the distinct, sharp scent of pipe tobacco that hadn't been lit in 20 years. It was a room Lydia avoided because it was cluttered and dark, but to me, it was the lungs of the house. It was where the history lived. I stepped inside and closed the heavy oak door behind me, engaging the brass lock with a soft click. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt loud enough to echo in the hallway. Robert placed the receiver back in the cradle. He swiveled his wheelchair around. The confused, vacant look he wore at the dinner table, the slack jaw, the glassy eyes, was gone completely. In its place was a sharp, focused intensity that reminded me of the photos of him from the 1970s, back when he was building his manufacturing empire. "You're lucid," I whispered, walking toward him. "I'm old, Martha, not brain dead," he said, his voice stronger now, though still rasping with age. "But it serves me to let them think I am. People say the most interesting things when they think they're talking in front of a piece of furniture." He wheeled himself over to the wall of built-in bookshelves. "Lydia has been planning this party for months. She thinks I've been staring out the window at the birds. What I've actually been doing is watching the courier vans. She's been liquidating assets, Martha. Slowly, selling off bonds, cashing in old policies. She's bleeding the estate dry." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "But why? Robert, she has the trust fund." "Had," Robert corrected. "She burned through her portion years ago. Bad investments, worse friends, and Vanessa, that girl hasn't earned $1 she didn't immediately spend on a handbag. They need the real estate because it's the only thing left with any real meat on the bone. They don't want to live here. They want to strip it for parts." He reached for a thick, leather-bound volume on the shelf, History of the County, Vol II. He pulled it out, revealing a small, hidden safe embedded in the wall behind the books. "Mark doesn't know," I asked. "Mark is a good boy," Robert said, his fingers deftly working the combination dial. "But he has a soft heart. He can't believe his mother is a shark. He thinks she's just difficult. He doesn't realize she's a predator. If I told him he'd confront her, she'd cry and he'd back down. We need a different approach. We need leverage." The safe popped open. Robert reached in and pulled out a thick file folder and a set of heavy, iron keys. "This," he said, handing me the folder, "is the original deed to this house and the lake cottage, and the correspondence from my attorney, Henderson. Lydia has a power of attorney that allows her to manage my current finances. But she forgets that the deed is in a trust where I retain the right to transfer title inter vivos, while I am living without her consent." I opened the folder. The documents were yellowed but pristine. "Henderson is coming on Friday?" I asked. "No," Robert shook his head. "Henderson is coming now. I called him on his cell. He's parking around the back by the service entrance in 10 minutes. Lydia is currently in her meditation hour with cucumbers on her eyes. She won't hear a thing." He looked at me, his blue eyes fierce. "I cannot leave this house to Mark directly. Lydia would manipulate him into signing it over to her within a week. Guilt is her weapon of choice. But you," he paused, looking at my hands, rough from sanding the floors. "You have a spine, Martha, and you respect the wood. I'm transferring the deed to you." I gasped, "Me, Robert, I can't, the family." "You are the family," he cut me off. "You and Mark, but I need you to hold the shield. Once the deed is in your name, it's done. Mark will benefit, of course, but you will be the legal owner. You will be the one who has to look Lydia in the eye and tell her no. Can you do that?" I thought about the way Lydia had looked at Mark at dinner, like he was a mistake she regretted making. I thought about Vanessa measuring the walls for demolition. I thought about the 6 years of sweat equity we had poured into this home, loving it when they ignored it. Yes, I said, my grip tightening on the file. I can do that. Good, Robert smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. Then go let Henderson in, and Martha, don't slam the back door. The signing had been terrifyingly exhilarating. Mr. Henderson, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite, had slipped in through the mudroom like a ghost. We sat in the library with the door locked, the only sound the scratching of a fountain pen on heavy paper. By the time Lydia emerged from her room, refreshed and smelling of lavender, Henderson was gone, and the documents were safely locked in his briefcase, speeding back to his office to be filed electronically with the county clerk immediately. The physical deed was now just paper. The digital record was the iron law. But we still had to survive until Friday. Thursday morning was a nightmare of activity. Lydia had hired a team of caterers, florists, and event planners who were swarming the house like locusts. I found Mark in the garage, aggressively organizing his tools. It was his coping mechanism. When life felt out of control, he sorted screws by thread count. She wants me to park my truck down the street, Mark said, not looking up. He slammed a wrench into a metal drawer. She said it's an eyesore and doesn't fit the aesthetic for the guests. It's your house too, Mark, I said softly, leaning against the workbench. Is it? He turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed. Because it feels like we're just squatters waity. NG for the sheriff. Vanessa told me this morning she's already picked out a condo in the city she wants to buy with the liquidated assets from the lake house. She hasn't even got the keys yet, and she's spending the money. I walked over and put my hands on his shoulders. The urge to tell him everything, to tell him that the house was actually mine as of yesterday afternoon, was overwhelming. But Robert had been adamant. The reveal must be public. It must be absolute. If we tell them early, they will find a way to stop the filing or claim I was coerced. We wait for the trap to snap shut. We need to go inside, I said. Lydia is demanding a family meeting in the sunroom. I can't take another lecture on gratitude, Mark muttered, but he wiped his hands on a rag and followed me. In the sunroom, Lydia was holding court. Vanessa was lounging on a chaise, flipping through a magazine. Ah, there you are, Lydia said, not looking up from her clipboard. Mark, I need you to power wash the patio. Martha, the florists need help setting up the trellis, and I need both of you to sign these. She pushed 2 papers across the glass coffee table toward us. What are they? Mark asked, picking one up. Non-disclosure and liability waivers, Lydia said breezily. Standard procedure. Since you'll be vacating the premises soon, I need to ensure there are no liabilities regarding the work you've done on the house. I don't want you coming back claiming you own a stake because you fixed a few pipes. A few pipes, Mark's voice rose. I rebuilt the entire septic system, Mom. Don't raise your voice at me, Lydia snapped. Just sign it. It also states that you agree to vacate the carriage house within 30 days of the title transfer on Friday. It's a clean break. It's generous, really. I'm giving you a month. I picked up the paper. It was a humiliating document. It essentially stripped us of any rights to claim compensation for the hundreds of thousands of dollars in labor and materials we had invested. We aren't signing this, I said. My voice was calm, which seemed to annoy her more than shouting would have. Lydia dropped her clipboard. She took off her glasses and looked at me with cold, reptilian eyes. Excuse me. I said we aren't signing it, I repeated. Mark, put the pen down. Mark looked at me, surprised by my tone, but he dropped the pen. You are pushing your luck, Martha, Lydia hissed, standing up. You are guests in my father's house. I have the power of attorney. I control the assets. If you don't sign this, I can have you removed by the police for trespassing the second the deed is signed on Friday. Do you want that? Do you want to be dragged out in front of the neighbors? I don't think you have as much control as you think you do, I said. I decided to fire a warning shot. I saw the notices from the bank, Lydia, the ones in the trash in your office. The color drained from Lydia's face. Vanessa stopped flipping pages. You went through my trash, Lydia screeched, her voice pitching up an octave. I was emptying the bin because you fired the cleaning lady to save money, I countered. You're 3 months behind on your own condo fees in the city. You have a lien on your car. You aren't doing this for legacy. You're doing this because you're broke. The silence in the room was deafening. Mark looked from me to his mother, his eyes widening as the pieces clicked into place. Is that true? Mark asked, his voice low. Mom, are you selling the estates to cover your debts? Lydia's face twisted into a mask of ugly rage. She didn't deny it. Instead, she lashed out. How dare you? She screamed. You ungrateful little spy, you think you know everything. You know nothing. I am the matriarch of this family. I do what I must to maintain our standing. And if I have to cut off dead weight like you two to save the ship, I will. She pointed a shaking finger at the door. Get out of my sight, both of you, and don't think this changes anything. Friday is happening, and when it does, you will be left with nothing but the clothes on your backs. I will make sure of it. She was trembling, not with sadness, but with the terrifying adrenaline of a cornered animal. She had confirmed everything Robert said. She was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. The confrontation in the sunroom changed the atmosphere in the house from tense to toxic. Lydia retreated to her suite and didn't come out. Vanessa, seemingly unbothered by the revelation that her mother was broke, probably because she assumed the house sale would fix everything, spent the evening loudly directing the caterers on where to put the champagne tower. Mark and I retreated to the carriage house. Mark was pacing the small living room, his hands running through his hair. She's broke, he kept saying. She's actually broke. She spent it all, Dad's life insurance, Grandpa's trust, all of it. She's been leveraging her imag. To get credit, I explained, sitting at the small kitchen table. But the credit ran out. That's why the rush. She needs the liquidity of the estate to pay off the sharks before they seize her personal assets. We have to tell Grandpa, Mark said, stopping in his tracks. We have to stop her. Grandpa knows, I said. He knows everything, Mark. He knows, and he's just sitting there. He has a plan, I said, choosing my words carefully. He's not as out of it as he seems. You have to trust me, Mark. Tomorrow is going to be hard, but you have to trust that there is a plan. Mark looked at me, exhaustion etched into his features. I trust you, Martha. I don't trust them. What if she tries something tonight? What if she tries to get him to sign something now? That was my fear too. Around 10:00 p.m., I saw lights turn on in the main house library. I crept across the courtyard and peered through the side window, hidden by the rhododendrons. Lydia was in there. She was tearing through the desk drawers. She was looking for something. Papers flew onto the floor. She opened the filing cabinets, slamming them shut when she didn't find what she wanted. She was looking for the deed, the original physical copy. She wouldn't find it. Henderson had taken the originals. Then I saw her pick up the phone, not the house line, but her cell. She was pacing frantically. I pressed my ear against the glass, but the double-paned storm windows muffled her voice. I could only see her expression. It was frantic, wild. She was gesturing at the empty safe she had discovered behind the books. She knew the deed was gone. She slammed the phone down and stormed out of the library, heading toward the stairs. Toward Robert's room. I didn't think, I ran. I burst through the back kitchen door and sprinted up the back servant stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I reached the landing just as Lydia was reaching for the handle of Robert's bedroom door. Lydia, I shouted. She spun around, startled. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes manic. Get away from me, she hissed. I need to speak to my father. He's asleep, I said, stepping between her and the door. And you're in no state to speak to anyone. He moved the deed, she shrieked. Where is it? Did you take it? Did you steal it? I don't know what you're talking about, I lied, my heart pounding in my throat. Maybe he sent it to the lawyer for tomorrow. Isn't that standard? Lydia froze, the logic pierced through her panic. The lawyer? Yes, Henderson. He probably requested the files for the transfer. She let out a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. She smoothed her silk robe, her mask sliding back into place, though it was crooked now. "Right," she muttered. "Of course. Henderson has it for the ceremony. It's fine, it's all fine." She glared at me with pure venom. "You're lucky, Martha. If you had touched those papers, I would have had you arrested tonight." She turned and walked away, back toward her suite. I waited until I heard her door lock. I turned and quietly opened Robert's door. The room was dark, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Robert was lying in bed, his breathing steady, but as I watched, one eye opened. "She didn't find it," he whispered into the darkness. "No," I whispered back. "She thinks Henderson has it for the transfer." "Good," Robert closed his eye. "Let her sleep on that lie. It will make the truth tomorrow hit that much harder." I went back downstairs, my legs shaking. The investigation was over. The trap was set. The stakes couldn't be higher. Tomorrow, in front of 50 of the town's elite, Lydia was going to reach for a crown and find out she was holding a handful of dust. Friday arrived with a suffocating humidity that made the air feel heavy, like a wet wool blanket. It was fitting weather for a funeral, which was essentially what Lydia had planned for us, though she had dressed it up as a coronation. By noon, the estate's garden was transformed. White linen tablecloths fluttered in the breeze, crystal glassware sparkled under the midday sun, and a string quartet played Vivaldi in the gazebo. Lydia had invited everyone who mattered in the county, local politicians, members of the Historical Society, and her bridge club rivals. She wanted witnesses. She wanted to cement her status as the benevolent queen passing the crown to her chosen princess. I stood on the periphery near the catering tent, wearing a simple navy dress. Mark stood beside me, looking like he was about to vomit. He kept tugging at his collar. "I can't watch this," he muttered, his eyes fixed on Vanessa, who was twirling around the center of the lawn in a dress that cost more than our car. "I can't watch them steal Grandpa's home." "Stay," I said, gripping his arm. "Just wait, you need to see this." Lydia emerged from the house like royalty. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and a wide-brimmed hat, channeling a cinematic matriarch. She moved through the crowd, accepting air kisses and compliments, her laughter tinkling like broken glass. She deliberately ignored Mark and me. To her, we were already ghosts. At 1 o'clock, the music stopped. Lydia tapped a silver spoon against a microphone stand set up on the patio steps. The feedback whine silenced the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," Lydia announced, her voice projected across the lawn. She beamed, clutching her hands to her chest. "Today is a momentous day. As many of you know, my father, Robert, has been declining." She gestured to Robert. He had been wheeled out to the patio, dressed in his Sunday suit. He sat slumped in his chair, a blanket over his lap, looking for all the world like a man who didn't know what planet he was on. Lydia had staged him perfectly. "Because of his condition," Lydia continued, adopting a somber, pious tone, "the burden of managing this historic estate has fallen to me, and it is a heavy burden. But it is one I must now pass on to the next generation, to the person who embodies the spirit, the youth, and the vibrancy of this family." She swept her arm toward Vanessa, who stepped forward, feigning humility with a practiced smile. "I am thrilled to announce that today, I am formally transferring the deeds of the main estate and the lake cottage to my daughter, Vanessa. She is the heart of this family." Applause rippled through the crowd, polite social applause. "And," Lydia added, her voice hardening slightly as she glanced toward Mark and me, "this transition allows us to streamline our lives, to cut away the parts of the past that no longer fit our future. It is a new beginning." She motioned to the notary, a nervous-looking man named Mr. Potts, who was sitting at a small table with a stack of documents. "Mr. Potts, if you would please prepare the transfer for signature," Lydia commanded. "I, as power of attorney, will sign on Robert's behalf." Mr. Potts adjusted his glasses. "Actually, Mrs. Lydia, I—" "Just the papers, Mr. Potts," Lydia snapped, her smile tight. "Excuse me." The voice came from the side of the patio. It wasn't Mr. Potts. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit stepped out from the shadows of the porch. He carried a leather briefcase. It was Mr. Henderson, Robert's longtime attorney. The crowd murmured. Henderson was a legend in legal circles here, a shark who rarely left his tank. Lydia froze. "Mr. Henderson, I didn't invite you. We have our own notary." "I am aware," Henderson said, his voice deep and carrying easily without a microphone. He walked up the steps, ignoring Lydia, and stood beside Robert's wheelchair. "However, I represent Robert directly, and there seems to be a misunderstanding regarding the assets you are attempting to transfer." Lydia laughed, a nervous, trilling sound. "Don't be silly. I have power of attorney. It's on file. I can transfer whatever I like." "You have power of attorney for management," Henderson corrected, opening his briefcase. "But you do not have the power to transfer assets that are no longer in your father's name." The silence that fell over the garden was absolute. The string quartet lowered their bows. "What are you talking about?" Lydia hissed, stepping closer to him, her back to the crowd. "Get out of here." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Henderson said. He pulled out a document stamped with the official county seal. He held it up. "As of Wednesday afternoon, the title to this estate and the lake cottage was transferred in ter vivos, a gift between living persons. The deed has been recorded. The electronic filing is complete." Lydia's face went gray. "Transferred? Transferred to whom? I didn't authorize that." "You didn't have to," Henderson said calmly. "The owner authorized it." Lydia spun around to look at Robert. He was still slumped in his chair. He can't authorize anything. He's senile. He doesn't even know what day it is." "Is that so?" Robert sat up. He pulled the blanket off his lap and tossed it onto the ground. He straightened his tie and looked his daughter dead in the eye. The senile old man vanished, replaced by the titan of industry he had once been. "It's Friday, Lydia," Robert said, his voice booming into the microphone Henderson tilted toward him. "It's Friday, and you're fired." The crowd gasped. Someone in the back actually dropped a glass. "Dad," Lydia whispered, stumbling back, You can talk." "I've always been able to talk," Robert said, his eyes cold. "I just stopped because I didn't like what I was hearing. I heard you planning to sell the lake house to pay off your gambling debts. I heard you tell Vanessa she could bulldoze the library. I heard you call Mark a loser because he works with his hands." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I transferred the house to the only person in this family who knows the value of a foundation. The house belongs to Martha." Lydia whipped her head around to look at me, her eyes were bulging. "Martha, you gave my house to the help." "She isn't the help," Mark said, his voice breaking through the shock. He walked up the steps, stepping between his mother and me. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "She's my wife, and apparently she's your landlord." "No," Lydia screamed. The facade crumbled completely. She lunged for the papers in Henderson's hand. "This is fraud. She manipulated him. She coerced him. I'll sue everyone." "You can try," Henderson said, stepping back and closing the file. "But I have video testimony of Robert signing the documents, clearly stating his intent and his mental capacity. And I also have the foreclosure notices for your personal condo, Lydia. If I were you, I'd be more worried about where you're going to sleep tonight than suing the new owner of this estate." Vanessa, who had been standing frozen with her mouth open, suddenly threw her champagne glass into the bushes. "You said you had the money," Vanessa shrieked at her mother. "You said if I came today, you'd pay off my credit cards with the lake house sale. You lied to me." "Shut up, Vanessa," Lydia shrieked back. It was chaos, beautiful, vindicating chaos. The guests began to scatter, muttering and whispering, eager to escape the blast radius of the implosion. Lydia stood alone in the center of the patio, surrounded by the ruins of her social standing. She looked at Robert, then at Mark, and finally at me. "You can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, tears of rage, not sorrow. "I am the matriarch." "No, Lydia," I said, stepping forward. My voice was steady. You were just a squatter, and your lease is up. The aftermath of the party was swift and brutal. Lydia refused to leave. She locked herself in the master suite and screamed that she had squatter's rights. Henderson, efficient as ever, had anticipated this. He had the sheriff's deputies on standby at the end of the driveway. Watching Lydia being escorted out of her childhood home by two polite but firm officers was a somber moment. She wasn't kicking and screaming, but she was hissing threats, promising lawsuits, promising ruin. But as she was placed into the back of a squad car, because she refused to hand over the keys to the Mercedes, which turned out to be leased and 3 months in default, the fight seemed to drain out of her. She looked small. Vanessa didn't stick around to see her mother's exit. The moment she realized the money wasn't coming, she grabbed a bottle of expensive wine from the catering table, got into her sports car, and peeled out of the driveway. She hasn't called since. We heard through the grapevine she moved in with a boyfriend in the city, repeating the cycle. Once the blue lights faded down the driveway and the caterers had packed up the uneaten shrimp, the house fell into a profound, heavy silence. Mark, Robert, and I sat in the library. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the floorboards. Mark was sitting on the floor, his back against the bookshelves, looking at the deed Henderson had left on the desk. "I don't understand," Mark said quietly. "Grandpa, why didn't you give it to me? I'm your grandson, I would have taken care of it." Robert wheeled himself over to Mark. He reached down and rested his hand on Mark's head. "I know you would have, son," Robert said gently. "You have a heart of gold, you're loyal, and that's why I couldn't give it to you." Mark looked up confused. "I don't get it." "If I had given this house to you," Robert said, "Lydia would have been on your doorstep the next day crying. She would have told you she was homeless. She would have used your love against you. Within a year, you would have signed it over to her to help her. You would have set yourself on fire to keep her warm." Robert looked at me. "But Martha knows that love requires boundaries. She knows that sometimes saying no is the only way to save the family. I gave it to her because she was strong enough to protect you from your own kindness." Mark looked at me, tears welled in his eyes. He realized the truth of it. He knew he would have caved. He reached out and took my hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving us." The next few months were a blur of activity, but this time it was joyful. We legally evicted Lydia's presence from the house. We sold the gaudy furniture she had bought on credit to pay off some of the outstanding utility bills she had hidden. We moved out of the carriage house and into the main wing. But we didn't just take, we gave back. Mark finally started the renovations he had dreamed of. He restored the original molding in the dining room. I turned the sunroom into a proper reading room for Robert. We hired a nurse to help with Robert's daily care, not because we didn't want to do it, but because we could finally afford to give him the best. With the estate secure, we could leverage the equity responsibly to fix the issues that actually mattered. Lydia tried to sue, of course. She found a strip mall lawyer who filed a motion claiming undue influence. It was thrown out of court in less than 10 minutes when Henderson played the video of Robert, clear-eyed and sharp-tongued, explaining exactly why he was disinheriting his daughter. The last we heard, Lydia was living in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. She works at a department store now, at the perfume counter. I saw her once, from a distance, spraying samples for a customer who wasn't interested. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. The grand dame persona had evaporated without the money to fuel it. One evening, late in autumn, Mark and I were sitting on the back porch with Robert. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. "You know," Robert said, watching the sunset over the lake, "this house has stood for 100 years. It's seen births, deaths, wars, and parties, but I think it's finally happy." "Why is that?" Mark asked, sipping his coffee. "Because," Robert smiled, patting the arm of his chair, "the termites are gone." I laughed, leaning my head on Mark's shoulder. We owned the house, but more importantly, we owned our lives. The image Lydia had tried so hard to curate was shattered, but in its place, we had built something real. something that would last.